Alright, let's look at the other directives that Angular provides for us. These don't necessarily fall into one simple category like the event directives do, but they do a lot of different things and they're very useful to know about. We've already seen ng-app, so we know what that one does. Next we got the bind directives, which are bind, bind template, bind HTML, and bind HTML unsafe. Let's start out with bind and see what that does. So let's go to our application and we're going to make some modifications to it. Let's go down to our h2. So far we've been using the expression syntax to fill in the value of the h2 tag with the name of our event. But there's another way we can do this, and that's with the bind directive. So I'm going to remove this and add in the ng-bind. Alright, now I'll go out to our website and refresh the page, and you can see that the title is still Angular Bootcamp. So that's bind. We've also got bind template. So I'm going to change this to a bind template. Now what bind template lets us do is go back to the expression syntax, but we can put in multiple items in here. So I'm going to add event name and then a space, and then event date. Now when we go and look at the title, you can see that it's giving us the name and the date together. There's a couple of different ways that we could have done this. This is just one of them, but this way could be pretty convenient. Okay, so let's look at bind HTML and bind HTML unsafe. Now one of the things that's kind of tricky is that the bind HTML directive is not actually in the main Angular script file. Instead it's in the Angular sanitize script file, so we're going to have to do a couple of things in order to get that directive to work. First we go down to the scripts. We're going to add that script file in. So now that we've got that included, we have to make another change. We need to go to our app.js, and in here we're going to have to put a dependency on the ng sanitize module. If you'll remember back, we talked about having multiple modules and how this is where we specify dependencies of our module. So I'm going to type in ng sanitize. Alright, now that I've got that in there, it's going to load the sanitize module before it loads our module so that anything in the sanitize module is available to ours. Now that I've got that, I can go back up, and instead of the h2, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to add in a new div. I'm going to do ng-bind HTML. Alright, so I've got a div that's actually got some text content in it, but using the ng-bind HTML, which again is in that sanitize module, I'm going to replace the content of that with what's in the snippet variable inside of my scope. So I'm going to go to my controller, and I'm going to create a variable called snippet, and I'm going to put a little bit of HTML in here. So I created this string that's valid HTML that's a span with a red 4 color. Okay, if you look right here, you can see that I got the hi there text, but you notice that the 4 color is not set to red. If we view the HTML, we can see that there's a span with a hi there, but the style directive has actually been removed from it. So this is what sanitize does. It goes through and removes anything that could be dangerous set, but still allows you to actually have HTML inside some kind of a variable and populate a page with portions of that HTML. Now we used to have the ng-bind HTML unsafe directive, but that's been deprecated. The Angular team determined that it was a complex enough scenario that it needed to be a little bit more than just a directive. So now there's a service involved, and it's still possible to bind unsafe HTML, but doing so is somewhat complex and well beyond the scope of this course, so we won't be covering it. The next directives we're going to look at are the hide and show directives. These two directives are kind of mirror images of each other. I'm going to go into my controller, I'm going to add a boolean called bool value and set it to true. Now I'll go back into my page and I'm going to create a couple of h2 tags. One that says show this and the other that says hide this. And I'm going to use the show directive on the first h2 and the hide directive on the second h2. Now this is a good spot to reiterate one of the primary principles of Angular, and that is to only manipulate the DOM using directives and never manipulate it directly in your controller. Instead of using ng-show and ng-hide, I could have just grabbed a handle to the DOM element inside of the controller, say using jQuery, and then call show or hide on it, but that would be mixing the concerns of the controller class, which would create more highly coupled and brittle code. So never manipulate the DOM from within a controller, or as we'll see in our next module, a service. Only do that through a directive. So we can see the show this. If we look at the HTML, you can see that the HTML for the hide this is actually in there, but it's got a style of display none. So long as that Boolean value is true, then the hide directive will hide the value. And as long as it's true, show will show it. But if I flip that Boolean value to false, now the hide this is showing and the show this is being hidden. The next directive we'll look at is the cloak directive. This directive allows you to hide portions or all of your page until Angular has had a chance to run and go through and parse the HTML and replace the directives or the bindings with the actual values that it's supposed to display. This is really nice because otherwise you might get flashes, especially on a slower client computer, where it shows the Angular syntax and not the value you want to show. The simplest way to do this is to go into your page and add it to the body tag. Once we do this, we need to go into our CSS file, and we need to add a special CSS rule, and that is this rule right here. This rule is actually documented in the Angular documentation for the cloak directive, so if you ever need to get it, you can get it from there. And what Angular will do when it encounters the ng-cloak directive is process that and hide that element until it has a chance to parse the rest of it and replace it with the correct values, and then it will unhide it. The alternative to doing this is to move your script tag for Angular from the bottom of the page up into the head, and that way Angular will process sooner during the page rendering lifecycle and find the ng-cloak directives and replace them with display none until it has a chance to parse the HTML, run its code and your code, and replace all of the directives and binding values with their actual values. Unfortunately, this is difficult to demonstrate because on a decently powered developer machine, that flash of uninitialized HTML is often so quick that it's difficult to catch. Alright, next up we've got the style directive. The style directive is pretty straightforward. In our code, I'm going to go over to our HTML page, and I'm going to go take this H2 right here. I'm going to add the style directive and set it equal to my style. Now I'll go back to our controller and add a my style variable, and I'll set that equal to an object that is a CSS command. Now let's see that in the browser. And you can see it's made the H2 red. Now we've got some companions to the style directive. Those are ng-class, ng-class-even, and ng-class-odd. The class-even and class-odd directives work just like class, only you use it inside of an ng-repeat directive, and they will apply only to the even or odd elements. So let's look at an example. I'm going to go back to my controller, and I'm going to add a variable on my scope called myClass, and I'll say that it's the class blue. Now I'm going to go into my app CSS. I'm going to add a blue class, and instead of the style directive, I'll do the class. Go to our browser and refresh that, and now the text is blue. Let's review what we've learned so far with a quiz. What is the purpose of the ng-cloak directive? The cloak helps us avoid a flash of unbound HTML. True or false? ng-bind supports multiple bindings. False. The ng-bind template directive is the directive that supports multiple bindings. The ng-class directive has two companion directives. What are they? They are ng-class-even and ng-class-odd.